It began with a blip, or rather, the sudden absence of one. On a frigid March evening in 1983, deep beneath the gray waters of the Norwegian Sea, a Soviet Delta-class nuclear-powered submarine, K-429, vanished from the Ministry of Defense's live oceanic surveillance maps. No radio distress signal, no sonar return, no satellite-tracked wake trail. It had been conducting a standard patrol route routine. Predictable. By the book. And then, nothing. The first Soviet assumption, mechanical failure. The second, crew mutiny or navigational error. The third, unspoken but growing someone was watching them, across a continent, inside the secure depths of Soviet naval headquarters in Severomorsk. Alarms flickered. Not publicly. Not to the West, internally. Quietly. The kind of panic that doesn't scream, it spreads like a virus through whispers in corridors, through redacted communiques and sudden changes in standing orders. Commanders barked for redundancy checks. Analysts reviewed the satellite photos in reverse, searching for any heat signature, any ripple of engine trail. Still, nothing. Then it happened again. 2 months later, a hotel-class ballistic missile sub disappeared in the Pacific, this time off the Kuril Islands. No distress signal, no signs of destruction. The sub simply ceased to exist on radar. When it returned to base 2 weeks later, the crew claimed nothing unusual. The voyage had gone undisturbed. They hadn't detected any tracking. No American contacts, no sonar shadows. And yet, Naval Command had lost them completely. By June, it was no longer a mystery. It was a crisis. Internal records now showed that multiple strategic submarines had gone dark for days at a time, not lost but untrackable by their own side. Worse still, the Americans showed no visible confusion. Their naval movements remained precise, calm, surgical. One senior Soviet admiral reportedly muttered to a colleague, "If they're not reacting to our presence, then they already know we're there." That was the moment panic took root, not because of what they saw, but because of what the U.S. might have already heard. At first, Soviet commanders believed it was impossible. Their subs were massive, yes, but shielded, armored, with acoustic dampening that rivaled any in the world. Yet something had changed. Something was listening below the surface, far beyond the reach of Soviet understanding. For decades, the USSR believed it had mastered the depths. Now, it feared the ocean itself was whispering its secrets to Washington, and soon, the fear would be confirmed. Because while Soviet captains patrolled in ignorance, American subs had already mapped every move. In the steel-gray offices of the Soviet Navy's main operations directorate, confidence was unshakable on the surface. Charts lined the walls, red pins marking Soviet submarine patrol routes that curved like claws through the Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic oceans. Intelligence briefings proudly claimed that American sonar systems, while sophisticated, couldn't match Soviet submersible speed, missile payload, or Arctic hardiness. Soviet doctrine echoed one phrase above all. They can see us coming, but they can't hear us leave. Except they could, and had been for years. The assumptions had taken root during the 1960s, when Soviet engineers favored nuclear propulsion over acoustic discretion. Their subs were louder, yes, but faster, and more heavily armed. Commanders believed speed compensated for sound. That raw offensive capability could overwhelm the quiet precision of NATO fleets. They believed U.S. sonar nets like SOSUS were outdated Cold War relics useful in theory, not in combat. They believed that deep patrols equaled invulnerability. Every assumption was wrong. Beneath the surface, the Soviet Navy's entire underwater doctrine was cracking, and they didn't know it. For one, their reliance on speed was backfiring. Faster subs meant more cavitation tiny air bubbles created by propeller blades at high speed, which produced distinct acoustic signatures. American subs, by contrast, cruised slower and quieter, with pump jet propulsion that muted their presence like a whisper in a storm. Second, their navigation systems were less advanced. Soviet subs routinely pinged active sonar to navigate near continental shelves, giving away their positions. U.S. boats, guided by inertial navigation and digital bathymetric maps, could glide in perfect silence for thousands of nautical miles without ever emitting a signal. Third, the Soviets underestimated the scale of the American sonar network. SOSUS, short for Sound Surveillance System, had been operational since the 1950s, but by the late 70s, it had evolved into a planetary web of deep ocean hydrophones anchored on seamounts and cable-fed to processing hubs in places like Naval Facility Brodie in the UK and Whidbey Island in Washington state. These stations fed real-time data to centralized analysis centers, where computer-assisted analysts tracked not just where a submarine was, but which class it belonged to based on its acoustic fingerprint. The Soviet Navy knew of SOSUS, but thought it was too sparse, too slow, too old. They didn't understand that the U.S. had rearmed it with digital processors and machine learning pattern recognition by the early 1980s. The system didn't just hear Soviet submarines. It could recognize individual propeller blade defects from thousands of miles away. And worst of all, American submarines didn't use sonar to find the enemy. They used silence. By 1983, the most elite U.S. Los Angeles-class boats were operating within 2 kilometers of Soviet boomers undetected, recording everything. Soviet captains, convinced of their stealth, reported nothing unusual. Their systems weren't malfunctioning. Their maps weren't wrong. Their doctrine wasn't broken. But their enemy was already inside the wire. For decades. Soviet naval doctrine had rested on 3 pillars: depth, mass, and intimidation. The belief was simple: if their submarines could go deep enough, fast enough, and carry missiles powerful enough, no Western Navy could realistically challenge them beneath the waves. That belief was forged in steel Typhoon-class steel. These giants were the embodiment of Soviet confidence: massive ballistic missile submarines, capable of firing from under the Arctic ice, carrying 20 intercontinental missiles each. To Soviet strategists, they were invisible behemoths, fortresses that moved silently, unleashed devastation, and vanished again into the abyss. Except they weren't silent. Typhoons, like most Soviet submarines, had one critical flaw noise. Every engineering choice in Soviet sub-design prioritized firepower and survivability over acoustic stealth. Turbine systems were loud. Cooling pumps created continuous tonal frequencies. Hull vibrations, poorly dampened, radiated through the ocean like bells. The Americans didn't need to search. They just needed to listen. And U.S. Navy doctrine, by the 1980s, had quietly shifted. It no longer sought decisive naval battles or anti-sub perimeter defenses. Instead, it relied on tracking. The logic was devastating: why sink a Soviet submarine immediately, when you could shadow it silently, learn its behavior, and know exactly where it was when the real war began? Soviet commanders had no answer for this, because their doctrine assumed one thing: the U.S. had already disproven that American systems could not track multiple targets simultaneously without detection. But U.S. nuclear submarines, especially the Los Angeles-class fast attacks, had become ghosts, equipped with the BQQ-5 sonar suite, towed array sensors, and ultra-quiet designs. These American boats could park themselves in the blind spots of Soviet sonar arcs, often tailing boomers for days without ever emitting a signal. More than once. U.S. subs followed Soviet ballistic missile submarines across oceans, even into their own bastions near Murmansk and Petropavlovsk. And when the Americans wanted to prove a point, they did. In a classified 1982 incident, an American sub surfaced behind a Soviet group near Kamchatka, just long enough to be noticed. The The Soviet ships went to full alert, but the intruder vanished beneath the waves before a single lock-on. Panic set in because the Soviet Navy now had to face the unthinkable. Their invisible deterrents were being watched in real time, doctrinally. This created chaos. If Soviet submarines could not hide, they could not guarantee second strike retaliation. If they could not guarantee second strike, their entire nuclear strategy based on deterrence by assured response was compromised. And if that was compromised, their naval power wasn't just weakened, it was obsolete. Inside Soviet planning departments, whispers began about quietness at all costs, but by the time their next-generation boats were designed to match the silence of the U.S., it was too late. The Americans had already moved on to undetectable. It was early summer, 1981. The Barents Sea rolled in midnight blue swells under a low Arctic sun. A Soviet Victor III-class attack submarine. K-324 departed Severomorsk for a 2-week classified patrol. Its mission was routine: slip into the Guyok Gap, Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom, and monitor NATO naval movement. Same route, same orders, nothing out of the ordinary, until the Americans followed. Unbeknownst to K-324's crew, they were being shadowed from the moment they left port. Tailing them was the USS Dallas, a Los Angeles-class submarine equipped with the latest in passive sonar technology and signal processing. Its sonar crew didn't use pings. They didn't need to. They could hear the Victor's coolant pumps, isolate the harmonics from its propulsion shaft, and even determine its course changes based on minor propeller cavitation. For over 3,000 nautical miles, the Dallas followed silently, maneuvering just outside the Victor's acoustic detection range. When the Soviet sub accelerated, the Americans matched speed without a sound. When the crew changed depth, the Dallas tracked their ballast adjustments through changes in hull resonance. To K-324's captain, the patrol was uneventful. But when the sub returned to port, a Soviet electronic warfare technician reviewing sonar logs flagged an anomaly, a low-frequency distortion that reappeared at regular intervals, just outside their detection threshold. When analysts reviewed the full acoustic logs, the pattern became undeniable. They had been tailed. Not for minutes, not for hours, for weeks. The conclusion was chilling. Not only had an American submarine stayed with them across half the Atlantic, it had done so without triggering a single alert, without surfacing, without any attempt at contact. Soviet counter-detection had failed entirely. When this report reached Naval Command, the response was disbelief. Some officers dismissed it as equipment malfunction. Others suggested the logs had been doctored. No NATO submarine could shadow a Victor at that range without being noticed. The incident was quietly classified and buried, but one admiral refused to let it go. He ordered a follow-up investigation that unearthed similar acoustic patterns from prior missions previously dismissed as natural noise. Now they looked like fingerprints. U.S. fingerprints. It wasn't a fluke. It was a method. A strategic shift had occurred right under the Soviets' keel. The Americans weren't just tracking submarines, they were harvesting their signatures, building sound libraries, perfecting tailing distances, and mapping every Soviet boat's acoustic fingerprint. The implications were staggering. The Victor class was among the Soviet Navy's fastest and most numerous hunter-killers. If it could be followed so precisely, any Soviet submarine could. Ballistic missile boats, cruise missile subs, even experimental deep divers. The Soviets had always imagined a clash of steel and torpedoes. Instead, they were being defeated by silence. This one incident didn't make headlines, but inside Soviet command, it sent a tremor. For the first time, senior officers asked a terrifying question. How many others have we lost track of and never even noticed? The initial reports were met with scorn. Inside the high-ceilinged chambers of the main intelligence directorate, senior Soviet naval officers sat around a burnished conference table, flipping through declassified patrol logs and sonar signatures. The admiral from Severomorsk stood silently as his colleagues dissected the so-called Dallas incident with skepticism, not concern. "This is not science," one vice admiral snapped, slamming the folder shut. "It's speculation paranoia dressed as acoustic theory." No one dared say it outright, but the sentiment was clear. To admit the Americans could track a Victor-class submarine undetected was to admit that the Soviet Navy had no answer. That couldn't happen. Not politically, not doctrinally. Instead, a safer narrative was adopted: mechanical interference. The ping signatures, command suggested, were likely distortions caused by natural thermal layers in the water or magnetic anomalies common in the Arctic. Any detection by NATO was likely a coincidence, or a lucky guess by a sub already stationed in the area. But even as the upper brass denied the implications, signals officers knew the truth. Analysts working inside the Soviet Northern Fleet's acoustic division had reviewed data from at least 5 separate patrols in which Soviet submarines had displayed consistent trailing frequencies, patterns too deliberate, too repetitive to be random. Still, the ministry refused to update doctrine. Behind closed doors, Soviet engineers were ordered to redesign acoustic dampening tiles and reduce propulsion noise. But publicly, the message was unchanged. Our boats are safe, and we are not being followed. To enforce this illusion, political officers embedded aboard subs were instructed to ignore minor acoustic anomalies unless verified through active sonar. Captains were told to dismiss phantom contacts as psychological fatigue. One commander, returning from a Barents patrol in 1984, was reprimanded for suggesting a U.S. sub had followed his crew into Soviet territorial waters. He was rotated to a desk job in Leningrad within the month. But truth is hard to bury in the deep. That same year, a Soviet Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine suffered an unexplained systems failure during a North Atlantic patrol. An engineering officer claimed they heard a faint mechanical noise following them for over 48 hours, like a second heartbeat behind the hull. They launched no countermeasures. There was no proof. But when they returned to base, they were informed the Americans had just released a photo taken near their patrol route satellite imagery that showed the sub's path etched like a scar across the Atlantic. Moscow still refused to connect the dots. They blamed leaks. They blamed cosmic radiation interfering with equipment. They even accused Norwegian fishermen of harboring NATO listening gear. But none of it changed the emerging reality. American submarines weren't just hearing Soviet boats. They were anticipating them. And as more Soviet captains began reporting anomalies trailing pings, ghost signatures, unexplained propulsion echoes one by one, the voices of denial grew quieter. Until soon. Only the Kremlin still believed the myth of stealth, desperate to explain away the increasingly undeniable failures in their undersea stealth. Soviet naval leadership clung to a new hypothesis, one they believed could preserve both pride and doctrine. It was a lie, wrapped in science. They called it the signal drift hypothesis. According to this theory, the strange acoustic anomalies Soviet subs were experiencing, the faint ghost signals, the unnatural echoes, the precise U.S. tailing behavior were not the result of American technological superiority. Instead, they were blamed on changes in underwater thermal currents and long-distance reverberation distortion. The idea was simple: the deeper and farther a sound traveled through the ocean, the more it could bend, fracture, or reflect back, appearing as a phantom contact when none existed. The Americans, Soviet scientists claimed, had simply learned to exploit these natural distortions not with better submarines, but with better data interpretation. They weren't tracking Soviet boats in real time, they were just guessing smarter. It was a comforting theory, and it was dead wrong. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy's integrated undersea surveillance system had already debunked this concept years earlier. SOSUS hydrophones, combined with advanced signal discrimination software, could isolate signal sources with pinpoint precision. While natural distortion existed, the Americans were filtering it out, not relying on it. But the Soviets couldn't accept that. To admit the Americans had achieved true passive sonar shadowing to the point of tracking submarines in near total silence would be to rewrite decades of Soviet naval engineering. It would invalidate entire fleets. It would demand billions in redesigns. And worse, it would admit strategic inferiority. Instead, Soviet command pushed the signal drift theory with religious fervor. Naval intelligence reports were rewritten. Submarine captains were instructed to categorize suspicious acoustic patterns under the new classification unverifiable echoes. Exercises were recalibrated to simulate detection failure as a result of oceanic variables, not hostile tracking. But the real ocean didn't cooperate. In a 1985 wargame exercise, a Soviet Alpha-class sub was lost in simulated detection off the coast of Greenland. Midway through, American forces correctly predicted its location within 50 nautical miles twice in a row. It was supposed to be a fluke. It wasn't. Even worse. Soviet attempts to replicate the effect using signal drift to track American boats failed catastrophically. Their sonar algorithms, rooted in less advanced processors, couldn't discriminate background noise from real threats. The more they relied on their own theory, the more blind they became. Meanwhile, the U.S. was upgrading rapidly. Newer Los Angeles-class boats were entering service with digital sonar suites and ultra-quiet cooling systems, rendering them nearly invisible. American naval doctrine had already moved on from listening. They were now profiling. But inside Soviet Naval Command, the lie persisted. It had to. Careers, reputations, and entire budget lines depended on it. To admit they had the wrong theory was to admit defeat. And so they clung to it until the evidence shattered everything. Not with a blast, but with a silence so complete, it couldn't be ignored. By the mid-1980s, the cracks in Soviet naval doctrine had become impossible to ignore. Submarines continued to go dark for hours, even days, without explanation. Their positions vanished not from American sensors but from their own. Patrols returned with bizarre acoustic logs, still brushed off by command. So Soviet naval intelligence conjured a second theory, one that shifted blame from physics to espionage. They called it the telemetry leak hypothesis. The logic was seductive. If American subs were consistently tracking Soviet vessels without visual contact, the answer wasn't superior technology, it was sabotage. Someone, somewhere, was feeding the Americans real-time location data. This hypothesis quickly gained traction among party officials. It fit the Soviet worldview, a vast network of Western spies, always infiltrating, always undermining. They imagined compromised encryption systems, radio leaks, even traitors aboard command vessels transmitting sublocations to NATO ships. Paranoia surged. KGB units were dispatched to major naval hubs: Murmansk, Vladivostok, Petropavlovsk. Hundreds of naval officers were interrogated. Maintenance crews were audited. Communications logs were shredded, re-encrypted, and scrubbed for invisible anomalies. Political officers ramped up surveillance across every fleet. And when the evidence failed to appear, they invented it. A sonar technician in the Pacific Fleet was arrested for pattern inconsistencies. A submarine captain who reported suspected American tailing near the Sea of Okhotsk was dismissed and accused of misinformation sabotage. The Ministry of Defense issued a directive to reduce internal reporting of anomalies, not fix the problem, but bury it. But the Americans weren't stealing data. They didn't need to. What the Soviets refused to acknowledge was that their submarines were leaking information into the ocean itself through vibration, temperature shifts, and acoustic fingerprints. Every piece of machinery, every hull joint, every propeller blade left a signature, and U.S. sonar systems, especially the mobile arrays towed behind fast attack subs, could now isolate individual subs, not just classes. Even more damning, the Americans were experimenting with underwater communication interception, using seabed sensors that picked up the minor electromagnetic pulses generated by Soviet systems. They weren't hacking encrypted comms. They were reading the water. But the Soviets, obsessed with betrayal, couldn't see it. At one point, naval intelligence proposed a full halt on encrypted communications during submarine patrols, believing the radio bursts themselves were giving away positions. Patrols were forced into near radio silence. The result: coordination collapsed. Subs drifted into unintended zones. One even collided with a fishing trawler off the coast of Norway after receiving no return orders. The true enemy wasn't betrayal. It was sound. And the Soviets were at war with the physics of the ocean. But Moscow wouldn't listen. They were chasing ghosts while the real threat moved silently, just outside sonar range, in the depths of the sea. The U.S. had already won a battle the Soviets refused to admit had begun. By late 1986, what had once been whispers in sonar rooms and quiet rumors among fleet captains turned into something Soviet leadership could no longer ignore: a pattern of disappearance. Multiple submarines across the Northern and Pacific fleets were returning from patrols having experienced unexplained acoustic anomalies, signatures that couldn't be traced, ghost pings that came and went, sudden silences where Soviet subs expected to hear the churn of enemy propellers. Some commanders began altering patrol paths mid-mission out of fear they were being shadowed. But Soviet intelligence had a bigger problem. They had no idea how bad it really was. There was no centralized tracking of these events. Each fleet recorded and stored its sonar logs separately, often encrypting them with incompatible systems. Worse, political commissars frequently filtered or censored reports before they reached Moscow. The result: a fragmented picture of a crumbling strategy. When the KGB's Naval Division finally attempted to assemble a full timeline of submarine contact anomalies from the past 2 years, what they found was catastrophic. Over 40 patrols had reported suspicious sonar events, but none were linked. In many cases, reports were classified so deeply they were never even shared with neighboring fleets. American analysts, by contrast, had been tracking the problem in real time. At facilities like Navfac Keflavik and Whidbey Island, acoustic operators working on the U.S. SOSUS network were compiling a growing database of Soviet submarine profiles. These weren't vague estimations. They were fingerprint-level identities: blade frequency, engine modulation, auxiliary pump rhythms, and hull harmonics. Each Soviet subclass, and often each individual boat, was catalogued like a card in a library. By 1987, the Americans had reached an intelligence milestone. They no longer needed to search for Soviet submarines. They simply waited for them to show up. And while the Soviets clung to outdated doctrines and sabotage theories, American submariners were performing trail maneuvers once thought impossible, tailing boomers for hundreds of nautical miles, recording every move, every sound, every depth change, then slipping away without a trace. The final proof of failure came not from the oceans but from space. In late 1987, satellite surveillance caught something unprecedented: an American submarine surfacing within visual range of a Soviet reconnaissance vessel in the Norwegian Sea, only to disappear beneath the waves again before any alert could be issued. The Soviets scrambled aircraft, but by then, it was over. When a briefing was presented to the Soviet General Staff showing the timeline and American position overlays, one admiral reportedly went pale. The submarine had not only penetrated a known Soviet patrol zone, it had remained inside it, undetected, for over 36 hours. This was no longer about tactical inferiority. It was strategic blindness. The intelligence services of the Soviet Union, designed to anticipate enemy moves, had completely missed a transformation in American undersea warfare, not because they didn't have the data, but because they refused to believe it. While Soviet commanders struggled to accept their mounting failures beneath the sea, the U.S. Navy had already transitioned from dominance to total underwater superiority. The shift was not accidental. It was the culmination of a strategy decades in the making, an ecosystem of intelligence, engineering, and silence. And at the center of it all was SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. SOSUS was a vast network of underwater hydrophones stretched across the ocean floor, anchored at key choke points like the Guyot Gap, the Bering Sea, and the approaches to the Pacific. It was the world's largest underwater microphone array, and by the 1980s, it had matured into something terrifying. SOSUS didn't just detect submarines. It identified them, its operators, trained to distinguish individual propulsion harmonics, could hear a Soviet submarine from hundreds of miles away and name the class within seconds. With enough data, they could determine the specific hull like an acoustic fingerprint in the dark. And those fingerprints fed into the next phase of American dominance integration. Data from SOSUS flowed into U.S. naval ocean processing centers in Hawaii and Virginia, where it was merged with satellite tracking, electronic intercepts, and visual intel from Allied platforms. This was not sonar warfare. It was total domain awareness. At sea, fast attack submarines like the Los Angeles class were the blade, designed for stealth, speed, and endurance. They were the first true shadow subs capable of trailing targets without revealing their presence, recording enemy movements, and disengaging before counter-detection was even possible. The BQQ-5 sonar suite on these subs had multiple passive arrays, including a conformal bow array and a long towed array that extended behind the boat. Together, they created a 3D soundscape tracking not only what was ahead, but what was around and even behind the submarine. The Soviets had nothing comparable. Even more devastating was Project Genesis, a top-secret database containing the acoustic signatures of nearly every Soviet submarine built since the 1960s. From the groan of a Yankee-class turbine to the buzz of a Delta-class reactor coolant pump. Each sound had been isolated, recorded, and cataloged. Genesis meant that no Soviet sub could hide even if it changed depth, route, or pattern. This capability turned U.S. submarines into hunters, but they weren't hunting to kill, not yet. They were hunting to learn, to predict, to build a war plan so precise it could be executed in silence. The doctrine became clear: find them first, follow them always. Finish them only if war begins. By 1988, American attack submarines had mastered a technique known as Crazy Ivan mirroring. When Soviet captains performed sudden turns to catch trailing enemies, a maneuver known as a Crazy Ivan, the Americans would match their arc from the opposite side, ensuring they remained in the Soviet sub's blind zone. It wasn't evasion, it was invisible choreography. Meanwhile, U.S. surface fleets were integrating the AN/SQR-19 tactical towed arrays, giving destroyers and cruisers the ability to detect and track subs from dozens of nautical miles away. Even aircraft, like the P-3 Orion, began using passive sonobuoys linked to AI-enhanced processing systems to silently monitor Soviet subroutes from above. Every layer of the American system was built on one principle: no more. Speak less. The Soviets had volume, they had firepower, but the Americans had something far more dangerous: omniscience without exposure. And as one senior U.S. Navy admiral would later put it behind closed doors, "We don't need to start the war. We already know how it ends." It began with a single message intercepted from the Barents Sea American fast attack submarine operating in declared neutral waters requesting identification. The frequency was standard, the tone procedural, but what followed was nothing short of catastrophic for the Soviet Navy. In March 1989, the USS Baton Rouge, a Los Angeles-class fast attack sub, conducted a routine patrol just off the Kola Peninsula, the crown jewel of the Soviet Northern Fleet. The waters were supposedly secure, ringed with layers of sonar buoys, torpedo nets, and patrolling diesel-electric submarines. And yet, the Baton Rouge penetrated these defenses undetected and began trailing a Victor Throy-class submarine without incident, until something went wrong. The two submarines collided at a shallow depth. There was no explosion, no loss of life, but the sound of steel scraping steel echoed through Soviet waters like a gunshot in a cathedral. For a brief moment, the Soviet crew aboard the Victor believed they had hit an iceberg or a seamount. When sonar logs were pulled, however, there was no doubt an American submarine had been within torpedo range without ever being detected. The incident made global headlines, but the real impact happened in Moscow. For the first time, the myth of Soviet underwater superiority collapsed in public view. Kremlin analysts scrambled to contain the fallout. Official reports blamed the Americans for violating territorial waters, but internal memos told a different story. The Baton Rouge had entered, tailed, and escaped while Soviet defenses failed at every level. The humiliation wasn't in the collision. It was in the revelation the Americans were always there. Soon after, more accounts surfaced. In the Pacific, a Soviet Delta-class boomer was discovered to have been tailed from Petropavlovsk all the way to the Aleutian Islands by the USS Bremerton undetected for over 3,000 nautical miles. When asked how the Americans pulled it off, one sonar officer simply said, "They knew what we sounded like. We didn't know what they sounded like." In an emergency naval briefing, senior Soviet officers viewed simulation footage prepared by their own analysts, showing hypothetical wartime engagements based on recent acoustic tracking data. The results were devastating in every scenario. U.S. subs fired first. Soviet boomers were sunk before launching missiles. Attack subs were destroyed before ever detecting a threat. The simulations weren't exaggerations. They were based on real patrol logs. And worse, Soviet engineers admitted that no current submarine in their arsenal could evade the American sonar net. Not the Delta Phes, not the Oscars, not even the titanium-hulled Alphas with their blistering speed. Every class had a sound, and every sound was in the enemy's library. When a final report was delivered to the Politburo, one admiral summarized it with brutal clarity. "Our submarines are no longer invisible. They are being watched, studied, and rehearsed against. In war, they would be dead before they knew the battle had started." The humiliation didn't end on the seafloor. It spread to strategy sessions, defense budgets, even to the pride of a navy once seen as the blade of Soviet power. The ocean had become a one-sided theater, and the Soviets had been cast in the role of unwitting actors in an American rehearsal for war. It wasn't just a battle of sonar. It was a battle of perception, and Moscow lost both. The full weight of the undersea war did not collapse Soviet strategy with a missile, or a torpedo, or a headline. It shattered under something far more insidious, invisible failure. By the final years of the 1980s, the Politburo could no longer pretend. The reports were irrefutable. U.S. submarines had infiltrated strategic patrol zones, shadowed missile subs, and slipped through anti-submarine defenses undetected not once, but repeatedly. The Soviet Navy had not been operating in stealth. It had been performing in a theater of American surveillance. And the worst part, they never saw it coming. This realization struck deeper than a tactical loss. The Soviet Union had built its military doctrine on the idea of balance on parity with the West. It was the illusion that while NATO had advanced aircraft, the Warsaw Pact had numbers. That while the U.S. had precision, the USSR had mass. That both sides could fight and survive. But underwater, there was no balance. American acoustic supremacy revealed a fatal truth: the Soviet nuclear deterrent was compromised. If its missile submarines could be tracked and destroyed before launch, then mutually assured destruction. The bedrock of Cold War deterrence was broken. The USSR no longer had second strike capability. That wasn't just a strategic crisis. It was an existential one. In internal sessions at the Ministry of Defense, generals floated insane proposals to deploy decoy submarines, flood the oceans with sound-reflecting buoys, even manufacture noise to drown out their own acoustic signatures. But each plan was too expensive, too late, or technically impossible. The Americans had designed a stealth war the Soviets never trained for. Even more damaging was the ideological blow. Marxist doctrine had long claimed that Western capitalism was driven by greed, inefficiency, and fragmentation. Soviet command believed in centralization, planned engineering, and collectivist innovation. And yet here, in the oceans of the world, it was clear capitalist R&D had outpaced them. The U.S. hadn't just built better submarines, they'd built better systems, flexible, fast, and far more secretive. Project Genesis, SOSUS, mobile sonar labs, AI-enhanced signal processing, coordinated Navy intel fusion centers. These weren't just technologies. They were proof that the decentralized chaos of the West had produced a war machine more adaptive than anything the 5-year plan could imagine. One Soviet naval strategist summed it up grimly in a declassified post-Soviet document: we were playing chess. They were already playing 3D chess with pieces we couldn't even see. By the dawn of the 1990s, the Red Navy was reeling. Shipbuilding was stalled. Morale collapsed. Budgets were gutted. The last generation of submarines still rolling out of northern shipyards was born into obsolescence. Every class was already catalogued. Every screw's vibration already known. It wasn't just about weapons anymore. It was about belief. And belief had crumbled. In retrospect, historians agree the battle wasn't over the ocean floor. It was over which system could see first and move last. The Americans had done both, and the Soviets. They had spent decades hiding from an enemy who was already listening, silently. Long after the flags fell and the hammer and sickle was folded away, the oceans remained quiet, but not empty. To this day, the deep sea still carries the fingerprints of the Cold War's most invisible war. Submarine wrecks lie rusting at the bottom of Arctic trenches. Abandoned Soviet sonar stations rot in desolation. And yet, beneath the silence, the systems remain active, just more hidden, more advanced, and more terrifying than before. What the Soviets learned too late became standard doctrine for the United States and its successors. He who controls the sound, controls the sea. The U.S. Navy never stopped listening. The successors to SOSUS, like IUSS, and advanced autonomous sensor networks, continue to sweep the world's oceans with unheard precision. Nuclear subs now carry AI-assisted sonar arrays capable of identifying not just enemy classes but captains, based on maneuver patterns. But the ghost of Soviet failure still haunts war planners. Russia, the successor state to the USSR, has invested billions into quieting its new submarines. Yasin-class and Borei-class subs boast improved noise-dampening pump jet propulsion and hull coatings designed to confuse sonar. But in naval wargames, NATO still wins the first detection and usually the first strike. The deeper truth: no one can ever go fully silent again. The oceans remember. They capture every vibration, every frequency, every unintended signature. And the databases that began with Project Genesis now run on cloud systems, drawing from satellites, drones, buoys, and mobile sonars. There is no hiding, only learning. The Cold War didn't end with a missile. It ended with a sonar ping heard by one side, ignored by the other. For all their posturing, Soviet admirals were outmaneuvered not by fleets, but by feedback loops. Their empire collapsed, in part, because their doctrine couldn't accept what their oceans had been whispering for years. They were no longer alone down there. And so, the sea keeps its secrets. But history does not. Because when the submarines vanished from Soviet maps, it wasn't magic. It was mastery.